Hey everyone, Ben from JangaFX here. In this video we're going to be looking at an underwater implosion effect. And it's one that's been quite commonly asked for in Discord and social media after the man, the myth, the legend that is Jason Key put up a video showing this. So just to break it down visually, what's happening in this effect is an object which we can assume to be some kind of depth charge is falling through our domain from the top down to the bottom. When it hits a certain point an explosion occurs, but this explosion very quickly folds in on itself, seemingly under the weight of all the water that's around it. And then once it's collapsed in on itself, it then pulses back out again and releases a load of bubbles which race to the surface. So not something you would immediately think of doing in EmberGen because it's quite a watery looking effect. But it's totally doable. We can have it up and running in about 10 to 15 minutes, and it's what we're going to do now. So we're going to break this down into 3 parts. First, we're going to prep how our water works. Okay, and we're going to use a combination of smoke and particles for the bubbles. Secondly, we're going to animate everything and set up the force for our explosion. We're going to use a point force in this one. It's going to push our explosion out, and it's going to pull it back into a central point, and then it's going to push it back out again. And then lastly, we're going to make a few changes and create kind of an in-camera environment via EmberGen. This one's kind of optional because, quite commonly if you're working with TV or film, you would already have your background in another app and you'd be compositing just the effect on top of it. But because we're doing everything in EmberGen today, we're also going to create the environment here. Totally worth noting as well that if you've got a pretty recent version of EmberGen and you've got the presets, then you've already got Jason's copy of this effect. And it's really good fun to sort of tear through his setup. In this video though, we're going to be doing a slightly simplified version that gets us most of the way to the same effect. And as usual, you'll be able to download this exact preset that we're building here so that you can tear that down and have a look and play around with it and build your own. Okay, so we've got our primitive. It's already falling. We've keyframed it from a starting position to an end position over the 300 or so frames. So I've decided that frame 300 is where everything's going to kick off. So at frame 300, our object has to be at the detonation point, and then later on we're going to set up our explosion to happen at that time. But first we're going to create some disturbance in the water as this thing falls through. And we're going to do that with a volume emitter. So we're not going to be emitting any fire in this tutorial. It's all going to be smoke. So we're going to turn our smoke emission on. And we're only going to use like 10 to 15%. I think 15% is pretty good. But right off the bat, there's a couple of things that I will change. So it seems to be moving up way too quickly. I want to give this a sense of scale, so I want it to be heading upwards a bit more slowly. So I'm going to bring our temperature down because that drives our buoyancy. Bring it down to 1000. And I'm also going to change a good old standby dissipation, velocity dissipation. I'm going to set that at 50% for now because what that tends to do is slow things as they move. But what we see now is as it's moving upwards more slowly, but it's getting thrown out a bit more as this thing spins. And I want to bring that down a little bit. So I'm going to go into our volume emitter, I'm going to go into forces, and I'm going to bring velocity transfer down to let's say 35. And we should find that it still gets moved around a bit as the object spins, but nowhere near as much. Might even bring that back up to 50. Okay, so I want this smoke to represent, like a field of bubbles that is so tiny that you can't make them out individually. I want this to be almost like underwater whitewater. And we're going to complement this with a particle emitter that's going to give us more distinct bubbles. But they're still going to follow the same forces, so they're going to be part of the overall effect. So we're going to bring our primitive down here, bring a new particle emitter in, and we're going to hook that up to our simulation. So as soon as we start playing, after we've brought our particle emitter in, it's a bit crazy. There's particles everywhere, and we don't want that. We want this to be a bit more subtle. So first thing I'm going to do is bring down the emission rate to say maybe 1000. That's already calmed it down a fair bit. But, they're a bit too widespread for me. That kind of works, but I want to try out the emission style of entangled. And that just gives us these nice strings of particles. That's pretty good. I like that. So we've got the motion that we like. I want to change the look of these. So I'm going to head over to shape. I'm going to give us a bit of variance in the size of these bubbles. And I can already see that, it's a little bit too close, a little bit too defined, some of these strings. I want to sort of spread these out a little. So we're going to go over to our emission. We're going to bring our jitter distance up. One's probably a bit crazy, but let's see what it looks like. all it's going to do is it's going to spread out those strings a little bit. I would bring this down to maybe 0.2. That's a bit more like it. All right, that's good. So we've got some variance in the sizes of these bubbles. And also it's not coming out totally uniform, which is what I like. So it's almost like these edges are tearing through the water and creating these bubbles. And of course, these bubbles are also riding along with the noise that's driving the smoke. What I might also add via our particle emitter is if I go into injection, I'm going to bring down the temperature. I'm going to bring up, what did we have in our volume emitter? We've got emission, set it 15. I'm going to inject some smoke via these particles as well. And we're going to see what that looks like. This is cool. This gives us the feeling that, you know, there's loads more bubbles there than there actually are. I might even bring that down to, say, 5. Yeah, that's good. I like that. So I'm going to add, we've got some noise here. Bring up the size of that. Bring up our octaves, and I'm going to bring in a second noise. And this noise is only going to affect our particles, because I want them to sort of shake around a little bit. There you go, a little bit more turbulent. That's cool, I like that. There's a couple more things I want to do to the particles. I want to go to life, give them a bit more variance in life. Let's go with 5 seconds maybe. And I'm going to bring up our velocity damping as well. That's cool, I like that. So I like the way that they move upwards, and they also have a bit of the motion taken from the falling object. That's cool. Right. I mean, that's only a small part of our animation, but we're going to reuse this as well. So that is our cycle mod. That's our primitive falling using the volume emitter and the particle emitter. So we know that when this thing gets to the bottom at frame 300, we want it to explode. Let's set up this shape to be inactive at frame 300. And we're going to keyframe all of this. So frame 300, we're going to enable keyframes for shape activity. We're going to turn it off. We're going to go to frame 299 and turn it on. Notice how it disappears and reappears. That's good. So if we go to frame 300, it should not be there anymore. That's exactly what we want. So it doesn't just disappear visually, it also stops feeding these two emitters. So these guys would also stop working. So let's just test that out. We're going to turn off our loop so that we can see what happens afterwards. There we go. So at that point, our explosion is going to take over. We're going to need 2 more emitters. So we're just going to copy and paste these guys. We're going to set this at 5. And we are going to bring in another primitive. We're going to make it a sphere. We're going to chuck it in here and here. That seems like a good size to start with. We're going to make sure this is at Z5, so this is the exact point where our cylinder disappears from. This is going to be the seed for our explosion. So we're going to turn these guys off for now, and we're going to plug these guys in. So our volume emitter, again, it's not going to push out any fire, it's just going to push out some smoke, some temperature, and a load of pressure. So let's just go with 200 pressure, and we're just going to see what this looks like. Well, there's definitely some pressure and it's pushing some stuff out. That's great. It's only going to need to be active for a few frames. So let's go to frame 300, turn on keyframes for shape activity again. We're going to turn it on there. We're going to go to 299 and we're going to turn it off. That's great. So we should have falling, falling, falling. As it gets to the bottom, the cylinder should disappear. We should get a sphere and a load of smoke. There we go. Okay, so now we want to contain this because this explosion is pretty wild. It just goes out and out and out and doesn't stop. So it needs to be much more abrupt and be over very, very quickly. So first thing, we're going to make sure we turn our shape off again. So we're going to go to frame, say 305, and then turn off our shape activity. So if we play this again, we should have cylinder falling. And we're going to get that smoke again at the bottom, but it should be gone pretty quickly. There we go. And we're going to do the same with our particle emitter. So instead of turning it on and off, you can do that. You can keyframe that. We're going to turn this off. We're going to use burst emission. And we're going to keyframe burst emission to come on at frame 300. So enable keyframes, turn them on. Let's also go all the way back and turn it off. Sometimes you have to explicitly state that something is off or on. So if you find something isn't working, check whether it's set on or off at the point in the timeline and then go back to before and make sure it's the opposite. So in theory, this time we should have some particles when it explodes. There we go. Now that one's actually creating a bit too much smoke for me. So in this particle emitter, I'm going to knock that injection right down, maybe to 1. I'm just going to check how that looks. All right, it's a good start. So we need something to contain and direct this. We need it to do what we want. We've got kind of the right amount of stuff and it's happening at the right time, but we want to create a shape. So we want to have this pulse going out and then falling back in on itself and then pushing back out again. So for that, we're going to go to our simulation. We're going to add a new force and it's going to be a point force. We're going to make sure it's in the exact same place as everything else that's going on because that's going to be the center of our explosion. If that was set somewhere random, then it wouldn't look very good. We're not going to use repel strength. We're going to use additional pressure. And we're going to use quite a bit. Let's go with 150. It starts pushing everything everywhere, all over the place. Now that's because it's affecting the entire simulation. So you could go miles and miles away from here and it would still be getting pushed the same amount out from that point. So we're going to need some fall off. If you turn on linear fall off, you get this bubble. And that means that the force will only be active inside of this area. And that's exactly what we need. This is a boundary to the effect that we're trying to create. But what we also need is a time for it to start. So that's going to be frame 300. So let's go over to frame 300. We are going to turn force activity on. That's good. We're going to turn on keyframes. Notice how it hasn't actually created a keyframe just yet. So we're going to turn off. We're going to turn on again. That's going to set it to on there. We're going to drop back to 299. And we're going to manually tell it to be off. Okay, I've dropped it down to 50 and you can see that it's kind of contained at that point, but it still shoots out past. It's now taking on that velocity and it's moving outwards from the air. There's nothing to pull it back. And in real life, what would pull it back is the weight of all the water around it, forcing it back into where it just exploded from. But we don't have that here. That's a bit computationally expensive to do, even an EmberGen. So what we're going to do is we're going to fake that with our point force. We're just going to send it into a negative value. And that's going to pull that explosion back into that central point. And we're going to animate that. So we're going up to, frame 300, which is where it turns on. Let's go to frame, let's say 330. And we're going to, right, so we're going to find our frame where we're on. That's good. We're going to turn on animation for our additional pressure rate. Now remember, it won't drop a keyframe in there straight off the bat, so wiggle it around a bit and then set it back to what it was. That sets the keyframe at 50. I'm going to go up to frame 330 and we're going to send this into a negative value, maybe minus 150. And we're just going to see what that looks like. So it should suddenly bust out and then go back in again. There we go. So it's not going to continually, become like a black hole in the middle of the ocean. It needs to then let that pressure back out again. So we're going to set another keyframe just a little further on. But instead of coming out at 50, let's come out at, say, 100 and see what that looks like. And very, very importantly, a little bit further down, we need to bring this down to 0. So like our pressure would then equalize. Everything happened. The explosion happened and then the pressure is equalized. So we set that to 0. I'm just going to see what that looks like. So this should fall down, explode outwards, collapse inwards, push back outwards, and then gently, stop moving in those directions. It should kind of settle. Okay, I've arrived at a look for the animation that I'm happy with. But obviously we're missing something. So you would expect there to be some kind of blast, some fire, some light. But we're not producing any fire in this simulation, so we're going to have to fake it. We're going to do that with a point light. So we're going to find a part of the animation where we've got some smoke. And we're going to head over to our shading node. And we're going to bring in a point light. This point light is going to have to be at 5Z, which is the center of the explosion. And we're just going to begin with, we're just going to bring that intensity right up. And we're going to swatch it out for like an orangey color. But we don't want it to be running all the way through the animation, So we're going to tell this to be on at frame 300, quite bright, and we're going to bring down the brightness of that over the course of a few frames. I want it to be quite abrupt, quite quick, gone in an instant kind of thing. So frame 301, that's frame 300. We're going to keyframe for on. We're going to go back to 299 to keyframe it off. So back to 300, we're going to turn our light intensity on. That's like 50. Let's go 500. See what that looks like. We won't see much at the moment because there's not much smoke. But then we're going to go up to frame, say, 320. And we're going to drop this down to 0. What I might do is even stagger that slightly so that we happen a couple of frames after the explosions happened. So Control, zoom in with the mouse wheel, and we're going to bring these guys just over by a few frames, and I'm going to halve the amount of time it takes for it to go out, because I really do want it to be more of a flash. That's cool, I like that. Okay, so we're most of the way there. So now we need to color this like it's underwater. There's a couple of neat tricks you can do with that. So first of all, let's look at turning off a directional light. We've got our ambient light here. This is good. Currently, it's just outputting a white color. So let's find a part of the animation where we've got some smoke, something like this. And we're going to mess with our ambient light color. Let's find like a bluish, and just bring that in slightly. Something like this. We're going to bring in another point light. I'll bring this guy down so I know it's the one that's at the bottom of the simulation. I'm going to bring in another point light. And we are going to get this guy way up in the sky. Let's go with 50. And let's make it quite strong. And then for our next trick, we're going to use a bit of volume processing. So we're going to use a post mod. So we're going to turn this one on here. Where it says source, we're going to use constant. And it's just going to give us a big block of smoke. What we want to do is, if we drag this guy all the way down, we're going to bring this slider here in our target range, the max. We're going to gradually bring it down. And eventually there will be a point where we can see the simulation in there, and also there'll be a very small amount of haze. And that's going to slow our simulation down a little bit. It's not simulating more stuff, but it has to draw more stuff. All right, wicked. I have pushed and pulled a few things around here. So I've added some more particles in our burst. I've also made sure that they only get birthed within certain areas. So there's a little cut out there just to add a bit more randomness. I've done that by using the inside masking shape on the particle emitter. So that's pretty cool. There's still a bit of work to do with the colours that I'd quite like to do. So let's have a quick look at that. We've got our shading. So currently this smoke, even though it's kind of bluish, it's quite dark grey when it's coming out. And we want this to be kind of white water almost, really sort of foamy, tiny bubbles. So we're going to change the colour in here. So this seems a little bit better to me. It's a little bit more defined, the smoke up here. Has more of a foamy bubble feel, and this is a bit more blue. So next, I want to tidy up these particles on the floor. We're not actually at the ocean's floor. So we're going to go into our simulation and then force. And we're going to turn off solid ground. And we might find that that slightly changes the shape of the explosion because it won't react with the ground. But let's see what happens. That seems good to me. I like these trails of bubbles here. Now, we're not too worried about what happens at the top. But what we will say is in the particle emitters under collisions, we'll say that non-ground bounds just kill and ground bound kill. We're not interested in keeping these particles around or having to do anything special when they meet the boundaries of our domain. So we'll just tell them to disappear. So again, that's in your particle emitter under collisions, and then ground bounds and non-ground bounds, just set them to kill. There we go, that's cool. There's nothing left at the bottom now. So you might have also noticed, because we've got this block of volume here, we've now got like some God rays happening here. We've got a volumetric shadow coming down because we've got a light source above, it's casting a shadow, which is pretty neat. The thing is, to make that more apparent, you would have to make this block of volume thicker, and then that would obscure this even more. So it's probably something you would tackle in post rather than doing in camera here. All right, I'm pretty happy with this. Now, for the purposes of this just being a tutorial, there's something that I would change given more time, and that is that this ground plane here, where we told the particles to die on contact, they actually just disappear when they cross this boundary. So if I were to do this again, I would set the point at which we detonate to be, maybe in a bigger domain, or certainly just a bit further away from the floor, so that the bottom of our explosion doesn't get cut off. But I guess what it does do for us is it kind of bottoms out the bottom of that, so we get like a flat bottomed explosion, which then that kind of directs the shape as it rolls upwards through the water. See, we get these trails here, and that's pretty cool. I like that. So maybe we could tighten up on the look of these bubbles a little. I know something that we could do, and that is for both of our particle emitters, set them to use under rendering, modulation over life, and then expose the modulation color. And we'll do the same on this one as well. So rendering, modulation type, modulation over life, and then expose this. We're going to bring this pin out here to a gradient, and we're going to hook this pin up to the exact same gradient. So both particle emitters are going to be getting the same modulation over life. And we've already got a gradient set up, and that is in here. And it's really simple. It's just white that's just been alphaed in and out over a load of points. And that would give the impression of almost like a flickering. So let's see what that does. So over the course of their life, these particles are going to become sort of visible and then invisible again. And I quite like that. I like what that does. I also like how, as it rolls upwards, the cloud of bubbles generated by this explosion, it actually casts a shadow through the water. So you watch it as it goes up. So we've got like a darkened area here. That's pretty neat. Okay, cool. We are going to leave it there, and I'll make sure that you can download this preset to have a play around with it. I would genuinely love to see other people's takes on it. So, if you feel like it, make a couple of renders and chuck it up in the Discord. We'd all love to see what you make. So until then, if you get any issues, any problems, just reach out for one of us on Discord, and we'll jump in and we'll help just as soon as we possibly can. And in the meantime, I will catch you in the next video.